All right, in this tutorial video, we're going to look at a fun decade that's kind of the having the fun before the storm of the Great Depression. So we're going to look at the 1920s. And we're going to start with the president that was elected in 1920, Warren G. Harding. In Harding's administration, he's going to emphasize a return to normalcy, which is return to normalcy after World War I. Looking at a quote from him about this, we must seek the readjustment with care and courage. We must strive for normalcy to reach stability. The forward course of the business cycle is unmistakable. People are turning from destruction to production. Industry has sensed the change order and is turning to resume their normal onward way. The call is for productive America to go on. I speak for administrative efficiency, for lightened tax burdens, for sound commercial practices, for adequate credit facilities, for sympathetic concern for all agricultural problems, for the omission of unnecessary interference of government with business, and for an end to government's experiment in business, and for more efficient business and government administration. So as you can tell from Harding's quote, he is a big fan of laissez-faire economics. Let the economy take care of itself, let business take care of itself. The government does not need to get involved. We need to let people produce. We need people to move on, especially get the government going again. And he also promises a lot of things, as most politicians do, and which probably helped him get elected. Unfortunately for Harding, he didn't always make the best of acquaintances. One of the problems he had is that he would appoint his personal friends to be in his cabinet. So unfortunately, he used the spoils system, as we've talked about in the Gilded Age. And one of the big things that happened was one of his cabinet members was involved in this scandal called the Teapot Dome scandal, where they had businesses exchanged for personal bribes, had to do with some oil reserves. But really the big thing out of this that you need to know is scandals like this lead to Americans mistrusting the government and mistrusting presidents. And we're going to see this happen a couple more times. So that's the big thing for Teapot Dome scandal. During this time, it's highlighted with a lot of economic prosperity. We're going to have some reduction in taxes. You're going to have a lot of increased production. Now that we're not making military items, we can really start focusing on other items such as the automobile. And this is also going to be when Henry Ford, with the automobile, as you know, is going to really revolutionize how production is done with assembly line manufacturing. So that's the idea of, as the car's going down the assembly line, one person puts on the tires, the other person puts the engine in, the next person puts the battery in, so on and so forth. So it makes it much more efficient and a quicker way to put together the automobile. Another person that you may hear of from the 1920s is going to be Glenn Curtis, and he's going to be associated with aviation. He's going to be the guy that convinces the Navy to buy their first airplanes. And he's also going to create what we call a flying boat and a sea airplane. And he also constructs the first airplane to cross the Atlantic Ocean for the United States Navy. So he's a big deal with aviation and its association with the Navy. Social issues during the 1920s. There were some advancements with society, but unfortunately there's also going to be some setbacks, such as the Red Scare. And remember, this has to do, anytime you see red in the Red Scare, it's talking about communism. And just a little background knowledge, 1917 was the revolution in Russia, which led to, instead of having a czar or a monarch, they're now going to be a communist country. So during the Red Scare, and going against communism, we're going to have a lot of fear of anarchists or communists trying to overtake the country. One example of this is going to be the Palmer raids. And this was when an Italian anarchist set off a bomb outside of the Attorney General Palmer's home. And it was part of a series of attacks on other public officials. And so, the nation in fear wanted action to be taken. So Palmer thought that this was a plot to overthrow the government, and so he goes on these series of raids, and they round up about 4,000 suspects without warrants, and they end up arresting a lot of these men for plotting to overthrow the government, and not a whole lot happened with them. Most of them were released, and then you had a couple hundred that were eventually deported. But this is an example of the hysteria and the paranoia with the Red Scare. Another example is going to be the Sacco and Vanzetti case, and this is going to be an example of suspicion of immigrants. They were Italian immigrants, and they were convicted of committing murder and during a robbery, and the robbery was done to get funds for an anarchist revolution. So the case, there wasn't a whole lot against these two guys, but the judge was very partial, and people wanted to, they didn't want America to look weak for letting these guys go, and so they end up convicting them and executing them. And so, again, another example of that mass hysteria and paranoia during the Red Scare of the 1920s. Another issue that's going to happen during this time is we're still having concerns with immigration and the rise of nativism. Remember that nativism is when you dislike foreigners. And so during this time, you're going to have a couple of immigration acts that are going to be passed. And mostly it's going to just be quotas on the number of people that can come in from Europe. And but it's also, we still have a ban on Asian immigration. So that's still going to be happening. But, Germany, Ireland, Great Britain, they don't have a very small, their numbers are larger for who can come in from those countries, but from Eastern and Southern Europe, we have stricter quotas on the number of people that can move here. Racism is still pretty major during this time in the 1920s. We are going to see what we call a Great Migration. This is going to be about 2 million African Americans that are going to move from the South, where racism is more prominent, and they're going to move to the Northeast and the Midwest, where they can find more jobs and hope for also to be treated better. Because of this big movement into the Northeast and into the Midwest, it's also going to show a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan had kind of went dormant, and during the 1920s, they start rising again, and they were very, not just hostile towards African Americans, they were hostile to immigrants, to Catholics, to Jews. They went around, there was still a lot of lynching, and then also encouraging segregation in the South. A person that you may hear about that has to do with African American rights is Marcus Garvey. He is going to be one of those that's going to advocate for racial unity. He also is going to advocate for what's called the Back to Africa movement, where he was encouraging African Americans to return to Africa, especially the country of Liberia. One of the unfortunate social issues during this time is the idea of eugenics and social Darwinism. Eugenics is the idea or the belief that the human race can be improved through breeding. So if somebody with a mental disability can no longer breed or have children, then that would hopefully lessen the number of children with mental disabilities that are born. So this was an idea that happened during this time. And also there were people that had the belief of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, for those people, they believe that different human races competed for survival, just like plants and animals do in the natural world. And so some people felt like the race that was the fittest were the ones that were surviving in terms of their economics and the progress of their society. Some of these ideas are going to end up spreading from the United States into Germany, that you'll see with Nazi Germany.